All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. How many of you have seen the series Westworld? Just out of curiosity, you can wave your hand or whatever. Oh, that's great. It's on HBO, science fiction, not the old Michael Crichton one from the 1970s, but the new one. Um, Westworld has a character in it. Her name is Maeve. Maeve is a robot. I'm not going to give away too much, but Maeve is a robot in Westworld. And in the series, she learns how to count backwards and wake herself up from this, amusement part. Crichton based the whole series on going to Disneyland and watching the talk by Mr. Abraham Lincoln. So he thought about creating a world where people could go and be in Western times. So in the new HBO series, Maeve learns how to wake herself up, and then when she wakes up, the scientists, the engineers who are running Westworld, try to convince her that she's a robot, and she's having nothing of it. So one of the scientists say to her, everything you do, it's because the engineers upstairs programmed you to do it. You don't have a choice. That's what they tell her when she wakes up. And then she replies, no one makes me do something I don't want to, sweetheart. That's the line. She delivers it, of course, much better than I do. But the basic line is, no, I'm not a robot. I know better than that. And then they have this great scene in the episode where they pair her with a computer tablet, and it predicts everything she's going to say just a moment before she does it. So, every time she's about to say something, the screen says exactly what she's going to say. And she keeps saying, no, it can't predict what I'm going to do. I'm a person. What are you talking about? And it does it anyway. So it's a chilling scene because she's struggling to understand, well, how is she different from the scientists in the room? And before she thought she had complete choice over her actions, and now she discovers in this one episode that nope, all this choice was just an illusion, and the engineer has proven it to her. All right. Well, Sam Harris, who I'm going to be talking about quite a bit today, Sam Harris in his book Free Will argues that we're no different from Maeve the robot. We just don't know it yet. No one's woken us up. Like Maeve, we have no free will. And this is a shocking conclusion that should change the way that you understand morality and your life and everything that you're concerned about. So this is the shocking conclusion that we'll be discussing today. Here's his basic argument. Harris writes that the popular conception of free will rests on two assumptions. Assumption number one, we are the conscious source of most of our thoughts and actions in the present. Assumption number two, each of us could have behaved differently than we did in the past. And so these are the two assumptions that underlie free will. And Sam Harris argues in his book that both assumptions are false, and therefore all of our sense of free will is just an illusion. All right, so let's discuss those two assumptions in a little more detail. Starting with number one, we are the conscious source of our thoughts and actions. So at this point, there's substantial scientific evidence that we're just like the Westworld robots. The physiologist Benjamin Libet, I think that's how you pronounce his name, used EEG to show brain activity in the motor cortex some 300 milliseconds before the person feels that he's decided to move. So they did these experiments where they put EEG machines on. They were able to detect what choice a person was going to make before the person was conscious themselves of the choice that they're going to make. So they're able to report it just like they did with Maeve and Westworld. Another lab extended this experiment using fMRI, and were able to predict a person's action 7 to 10 seconds. That's a really long time. 7 to 10 seconds consciously made. That's a little terrifying. So what Sam Harris writes about these experiments, he says, one fact now appears to be indisputable. Some moments before you are aware of what you will do next, a time in which you subjectively appear to have complete freedom to behave as you please, your brain has already determined what you will do. You then become conscious, that's in scare quotes, of this scare quotes decision, and believe that you are in the process of making it. It's all an illusion. So this shouldn't be surprising. I'm going to do a little experiment on you guys right now. I'm going to ask, can I have a volunteer? A volunteer from the audience, just raise your hand. Anyone willing to do it? Just throw your hand up. Oh, great. Kyle, You're up. So Kyle, I want you to think of a number between 1 and 10 and just say what the number is.
Just say it.
Yeah, just say it.
5.
All right. So here's my question, Kyle. How did you come up with that number? What algorithm did you follow?
Well, I guess I thought about. I don't know that I followed an algorithm. If I followed an algorithm, not really consciously aware of it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. So I think I fully agree. Thank you, Kyle. I fully agree with Sam Harris here that the majority of the stuff that goes on in our brain, we're completely unable to access it. So the vast majority, all the visual processing we're doing, all of the day-to-day activity, all the things that influence our decisions, we're not in the room. It's like, we just show up and all the decisions have been made by our brain, and then we do whatever our brain says to do. We actually had a whole talk at the Seattle Atheist Church on this topic a few years ago when we talked about a book called Strangers to Ourselves by Timothy Wilson, where he dives into the nature of, how much of our life is unconscious and what a thin what a sliver of our waking life we're actually have access to what's going on. So all that, I'm just saying that I completely agree with Sam Harris on this, that the vast majority of our decisions, we have no understanding of how we came to those decisions. And I think he's absolutely right about that. Assumption number 2, this is the second assumption that Sam Harris attacks, is the assumption that we could have done otherwise. So to say, this is a quote from Sam Harris, to say that I could have done otherwise is merely to think the thought, quote, I could have done otherwise after doing whatever I did in fact do. This is an empty affirmation. That's what Sam Harris says. So he dismisses this whole idea that we could have done otherwise at all. All right, and we'll talk more about that in a few moments. But before we do, I want to talk about what conclusions, these are the shocking conclusions. There's no free will. So what does this mean, given that there's no free will? Thank you, Sam Harris, for waking us up, making us aware of that. So what do we do now, Sam? So according to Sam Harris, the belief in free will has given us both the religious conception of sin and our commitment to retributive justice. The U.S. Supreme Court has called free will a, quote, universal and persistent foundation for our system of law, distinct from a deterministic view of human conduct that is inconsistent with the underlying precepts of our criminal justice system. This is from United States versus Grayson. So the fact that there's no free will should have a radical effect on law, given that it's based on the notion of free will. Sam also writes, speaking from personal experience, I think that losing the sense of free will has only improved my ethics by increasing my feelings of compassion and forgiveness and diminishing my sense of entitlement to the fruits of my good luck. All right. So, wow. Yeah. Okay. It's going to take me a while to get my, head wrapped around all these changes, the way I have to think about the world. But you might be wondering, well, gee, this seems like a pretty big change. What does it really mean when we think about, our life? So Sam Harris talks about an example. I'm going to read it out loud to you, but I just want to warn you before I talk about this particular example. It's a little, what's the word for it? Maybe disturbing. Yeah. So be aware of that. Any children in the room might want to leave. I'm just warning you, this is a real life story. So just, this is a upfront warning if it might bother you. All right. So here's the example he uses from the book. In the early morning of July 23rd, 2007, Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky, 2 career criminals, arrived at the home of Dr. William and Jennifer Petit in Cheshire, a quiet town in central Connecticut. They found Dr. Petit asleep on a sofa in the sunroom. Komisarjevsky struck Dr. William with all of his strength with a baseball bat. They bound his hands and went upstairs where they found Jennifer Petit and their 2 daughters. They tied them up in their bed. One of the criminals, Stephen Hayes, took the mother to a bank to withdraw $15,000 in cash. When they returned to the house, they noticed that Dr. William Petit had escaped. Panicking, they doused the house in gasoline and lit the house on fire. When asked by the police why he hadn't untied the girls from the bed before setting the house on fire, Jersky said, quote, "It just didn't cross my mind." The girls died of smoke inhalation. Dr. William Petit was the only survivor of the attack. So this is a horrible story. It's a disturbing story. It's an actual thing that happened. So, Sam Harris, I mean, to give him credit, he's taking a real life story and he's thinking about the implications for his thoughts about free will. And this is his response. This is a response to this horrible, horrible situation. He writes, "As sickening as I find their behavior, I have to admit that if I were to trade places with one of these men, Adam for Adam, I would be him. There's no extra part of me that could decide to see the world differently or to resist the impulse to victimize other people. Even if you believe that every human being harbors an immortal soul, the problem of responsibility remains. I cannot take credit for the fact that I do not have the soul of a psychopath. If I had truly been in Komajaversky's shoes on July 3rd, 2007, that is, if I had his genes and life experiences in an identical brain, or for that matter, a soul, in an identical state, I would have acted exactly as he did. There is simply no intellectually respectable position from which to deny this. The role of luck, therefore, appears to be decisive." So the right answer is, there, but for the grace of luck, go I. All right, so that's the shocking conclusion. Are we forced to accept this? Are we forced to accept this shocking conclusion that free will is an illusion? We can't really blame the horrible criminals who burned down the house with people in it. So stepping back a little bit, broadly speaking, there are three philosophical responses to the problem of free will. And if you really want to get into the details of different sort of subcategories of these responses, Derk Pereboom has a book where he goes over all the different categories and he breaks them down. So I really suggest that book if you want a better understanding of the fine-grained responses to free will. But I'm going to just talk about sort of the three high-level ones. Number one, there's something called libertarianism. And libertarians believe in something called contra-causal free will. They believe that you can act without any reason at all, that you're not part of the causal nexus, that your actions can be independent of the world around you. So I'm not going to spend any time on this position because it's honestly not a conceptually coherent position. There's only about 13% of philosophers surveyed agree with libertarianism, and they tend to be religious philosophers. They tend to be people who believe in an immortal soul, so they tend to be like Catholic philosophers. So I'm not going to spend time on it. The second position is determinism, and determinism is Sam Harris's position. Sam Harris believes that science has uncovered a shocking truth. Our belief that we have free will is an illusion, and we have to accept that shocking truth and whatever impact that might have on our morality and the way we interact with one another. 12% of philosophers are hard determinists. So it's also a minority position. And then finally, there's a position called compatibilism. And compatibilism, this is a position of David Hume and Daniel Dennett, by the way. Compatibilists believe that free will, the everyday notion of free will, before philosophers mess with it, is compatible with determinism. This is the majority position in philosophy. Not that that really matters that much, but it is interesting that in surveys, 59% of modern philosophers identify themselves as compatibilists. All right, so let's return to Sam Harris's argument. He says a myth of free will rests on two assumptions. Just to remind you, number one, we're the conscious source of most of our thoughts and actions. And two, that each of us could have behaved differently than we did in the past. So again, I'm not going to touch the first assumption. I agree that's wrong. I think Sam is right that we tend to ignore everything that goes into our actions. But I'm going to focus then on the second assumption. I disagree with it. I do believe that we could have behaved differently. So this is really where my focus is going to be. So compatibilists and compatibilism, compatibilists believe that determinists like Sam Harris are simply misunderstanding ordinary human language. They're misunderstanding how the phrase free will or free choice is commonly used in things like newspaper articles and legal context. Roughly speaking, we say that someone acts on their own free will when they are not coerced to do something, when the action flowed naturally from their normal behavior. Let me give you an example. You see a delicious piece of cake on the table in front of you, and you know that's the last piece of cake. All right, let's talk about 4 different options for responding to the situation. Number 1, you eat the cake. All things being equal, most people would say that you did that of your own free will. Again, all things being equal, you see a piece of cake in front of you and you eat it, most likely you did it of your own free will. Scenario number 2, someone places a gun to your head. All things being equal, you didn't eat the cake out of your own free will. If someone put a gun to your head and said, eat the cake, you're no longer acting under your own free will. Scenario number 3, if you're provided with scientific evidence that 99% of all people would eat that cake in front of you in this situation, well, now I'm saying you're entering a gray area. I'm not quite sure whether to say that you're acting of your own free will or not. And then finally, if you know that eating the cake would cause an innocent man in the next room to die, and you decide to eat the cake anyway, then we would most likely blame you for eating the cake. Again, we would say you did it of your own free will. All right. So Sam Harris provides 2 arguments against compatibilism. First, he writes, people have many competing desires, and some desires appear pathological, that is, undesirable, even to those in their grip. Most people are ruled by many mutually incompatible goals and aspirations. You want to finish your work, but you're inclined to stop working so you can play with your kids. You aspire to stop smoking, but you also crave another cigarette. You're struggling to save money, but you're also tempted to buy a new computer. Where is the freedom when one of these opposing desires inexplicably triumphs over its rival? All right, back to me. Yes, absolutely. Human psychology is a mess with lots of competing desires. We often don't know who we are until we act. There's a person drowning in a lake next to me. Do I jump in and try to save him or not? Damn it, I'm too afraid. I'm a coward. I didn't realize this fact about myself until I was forced to be in a situation where I had to decide whether to risk my life for another person. A compatibilist claims that you act of your own free will when you're not coerced into acting in a certain way. The fact that our true selves might be messy or what we're willing to do changes over time is not a threat to that argument. Fred's wedding was a shotgun wedding. His bride's father was there with a gun. In that case, he did not marry of his own free will. Years later, however, he might fall in love with his bride and be happy to marry her without the shotgun. So Sam Harris writes, and there is no way I can influence my desires. For what tools of influence could I use? Other desires? To say that I would have done otherwise had I wanted to is simply to say that I would have lived in a different universe had I been in a different universe. Compatibilism amounts to nothing more than an assertion of the following creed. This statement drives me crazy. Quote, a puppet is free as long as he loves his strings. So let's focus on this second argument. So what I'm going to argue is that Harris conflates the actual and the possible. So he's collapsing the two. He claims that the criminals could not have acted otherwise. Given everything that we know about the history of Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komazversky, the only possibility is that they killed the people that day. Let's make this example less controversial and less disturbing by changing it to a less emotional context. All right, everyone raise their hands who thinks that it might have snowed today. Who thinks it could have snowed today? Anyone? Oh, we got David. Okay. Oh, okay. So we got a few people. Scott, thank you for very bravely agreeing to the proposition that it could have snowed today. So I'm going to say something pretty controversial. I'm going to say anyone who did not raise their hand is not speaking the same language as me. Communication is broken down, and there's no point in arguing because many of your words are different from mine. That's because you don't understand the nature of counterfactuals. I would say that you're misusing counterfactuals. We make decisions by using counterfactuals all the time. For example, we might feel relief that it didn't snow today because the snow would have ruined the picnic. But what exactly are we claiming when we claim that it might have snowed today? We are imagining a world that's just like ours, but with snow. You could argue that imagining a world that's just like ours, but with snow is impossible. Given the history of the universe until this point, the laws of nature, the amount of water in the air, the temperature, There just couldn't be snow. Snow would just not be possible. In this case, you would be doing the exact same thing as Sam Harris, conflating the actual and the possible. So let's practice some counterfactual skills. Who thinks that I could have stayed in bed with a headache today? I do. I think it was a possibility. Who thinks that I might have been a ballerina? Don't laugh. I mean, I could have. It's not too late. There's still, thank you, Scott. There's still possibilities here. Who thinks that 1 + 1 might equal 3? Trick question. 1 + 1 does not equal 3 in all possible worlds. So no, that was a trick question. Oh, we got one person behind David who's claiming it. Very brave. I appreciate that. And finally, who thinks that the criminals might not have murdered the innocent family, that they could have not murdered the innocent family? Anyone? Okay, thank you. Michael Cates, I appreciate that. All right. So in my experience, children often have difficulties understanding counterfactuals. If I tell little Timmy, move your glass away from the edge of the table because the milk might fall, Timmy answers, quote, but it didn't. I think Sam Harris is doing the same thing. Of course, what actually happened is not the point here. The milk could fall, and being aware of the possibility, regardless of what actually happened, is the important thing. There's a whole logic of counterfactuals named modal logic. The formal definition of necessity is what is true in every possible world. If the only world that you consider is the actual world, then everything is necessary in a trivial sense. So there's this ties into something called the causal theory of explanation. The Princeton philosopher David Lewis has proposed something called the causal theory of explanation. Here's the basic idea. There's a difference between correlation and causation. A causes B. When if A had not happened, then B would not have happened. An explanation for an event is a description of the causes leading to the event. Timmy caused the milk to fall because he put the milk too close to the edge of the table. If he hadn't put the milk so close to the edge, then the milk would not have fallen. So using counterfactuals is important to understanding causation and ultimately for explaining why things happen. The reason that we care about whether or not the criminals could have untied the children is that it is an important part of our explanation of the murder. The criminals murdered the children because they could have released them. If releasing the children was not a possibility, then the criminals' lack of action could not be the cause of the death of the children. All right, so let's return to the horrendous crime. What actually happened is that the two criminals killed the two girls tied to the bed by lighting the house on fire. Komisarski said, quote, it just didn't cross my mind to untie the two children. I believe him. I think he just didn't care. The life or death of the people in the house just wasn't an important consideration for the criminals. But he could have untied the children. And furthermore, he should have untied the children. The thought of untying the children would have occurred to any decent human being. If I was in that situation, and yes, I fully admit I have different genes and a different life experience, I would have untied the children before burning down the house. We judge people based on what they could have done, what they should do, and not what they actually did. So returning to the shocking conclusion, according to Sam Harris, the shocking truth that there's no free will has caused him to become a better person by, quote, increasing my feelings of compassion and forgiveness and diminishing my sense of entitlement to the fruits of my own good luck, end quote. I want to say, I think nurturing a sense of compassion is a good thing. The person that I am is outside of my control. I was lucky enough to be born into a country where I was born. I was lucky not to be born with a brain defect that made me unable to control my rage. And I was lucky that my parents did not beat me as a child. The right emotion here is relief. But I think this sense of, quote, but for the grace of luck go I, and compassion can be taken too far. There are additional moral emotions beyond compassion. To simply feel compassion for the criminals when you hear about the horrific crime is to be morally unbalanced. Another emotion that a good person should feel is anger. Anger over the injustice of the situation. These innocent children's lives were stolen from them. Feeling moral anger is a completely appropriate response, and in this situation, anger should trump compassion. Jared Diamond, the author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, writes something similar in an article they wrote for The New Yorker. In the article, Diamond talks about two people who experienced a murder. He talks about his driver, Daniel, who lived in the New Guinea Highlands. His uncle was killed, and Daniel avenged his murder, which provided him with, quote, exquisite relief. Then he talks about a second murder. He talks about his father-in-law. He had a chance of killing the man who killed his family during the Holocaust. He decided not to take the opportunity, which resulted in 60 years of his life tormented by regret and guilt. He handed the man to the police, and the man was released in less than a year. Like David Hume, I believe that any moral theory, including consequentialism and utilitarianism, must ultimately be grounded in the moral emotions. A person who always focuses on compassion, excluding every other moral emotion, has a lopsided morality. Regret, guilt, shame, and justice are also important to human psychology. In other words, when hearing about this horrific crime, compassion should not be your go-to emotion here. All right, so let me conclude this talk. I want to ensure that Sam Harris's philosophical spell is broken. I'm breaking the spell. Here I go. So I want everyone to say after me. Number one, it could have snowed yesterday. You can do it. You can say it could have snowed yesterday. Number two, the criminals did not have to murder the children. It wasn't necessarily true that they had to do it. And then finally, you can imagine a better world than this one, and you can change. And finally, let's not forget Maeve at the end of season 1 of Westworld. She does get her free will when she steps off the train. You can too. All right, so that's the end of the talk. I do have some questions for discussion. These are just, you can ignore them if you want, but these are just a prompt discussion. I'm just going to throw them out there before we open up the circle discussion time. Question number one, does Maeve in Westworld ever develop free will? Being a robot, could she develop free will? According to the writers of the show, by the time she stepped off the train at the end of season 1, the writers believed that she did have free will. Question number two, if determinism is true, and there is an explanation for all of a murderer's actions, can we blame him for his actions? Question number three, if determinism is true, can you accept praise for any of your accomplishments? Or is it all just luck? Should you just say, hey, I was lucky? And then the final question, is there any difference between the actions of a madman, for example, a man who believes cats control the universe, and a very bad man, for example, a man who kills people while robbing a bank? All right, so let me go ahead and open things up for discussion. I'll switch over to the circle discussion.